This is a wonderful opportunity to come together to share knowledge and to learn from each other. The 2 days is very full. It's a very full program, and I think you'd probably share with me the recognition that we could probably spend 2 days on one topic of homicide, one form of homicide, whether it was parricide or filicide or intimate partner homicide. The reality is we're trying to cover a broad landscape of different forms of homicide to try to share with you some important research, but also opportunities to dialogue and to question researchers and practitioners. This conference has drawn together some wonderfully motivated students, some members of the practitioner communities, the NGO community, government community, academics, and other experts. So we are a diverse community in this room, and I think that bodes well for a really exciting 2 days. I want to, before proceeding through some of the housekeeping, I truly want to reflect that this is a partnership between Griffith and the Institute of Criminology. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to work with Adam and his organization and his leadership pulling this together. The Institute of Criminology is one of our jewels in crime and justice in Australia. It's known throughout the world, and certainly before I came to Australia, I was well aware of their great work. So it's great to partner with them. Now, before we kick off with our first keynote, Adam Tomison has agreed, and I think this is entirely appropriate to set the scene for homicide in Australia, and so he's going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes. So, Adam, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I'd also like to pay my respects to Indigenous custodians of the land which we're meeting today, and also pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the hard work that Paul in particular has put into actually getting this event going and arranging such a fantastic crew of speakers, including the Chief Commissioner. So well done, Paul. I think this is actually really your baby, but we were certainly very happy to be partnering with you. So my plan this morning is just very briefly to sort of touch on some key stats and sort of try and set the scene a little. And clearly we'll be getting into a lot of these areas in a lot more detail on the actual sessions that will be coming, but I thought it was just nice as a way of starting things off to sort of talk about where we are. Good start. So the Institute of Criminology has its National Homicide Monitoring Program, which has been collecting data on all homicides in Australia since 1989-90, so we have about 22 years of data now. And we collect information on homicide cases defined as all cases resulting in a person or persons being charged with murder or manslaughter, excluding most driver-related fatalities, all murder-suicides classified as murder by police, all other deaths classified by police as homicide, including infanticides, whether or not an offender has been apprehended. And basically, what we're going to do is use the data set from the National Homicide Monitoring Program to sort of give you some key trends. And there's good news and bad news. And the good news is that the number of incidents of homicide, the rate of homicide has been decreasing quite consistently over the last 22 years. We've actually seen a 20% decrease in the number of homicides occurring, which is great. The bad news is, I guess, if you're actually experiencing that in your family, it's not going to help you at all. It's still going to feel pretty traumatic. And what we're here to do, obviously, is try and reduce the number still further. So in terms of actual rates, the homicide rate in Australia actually is now at a historical low, 1.1 per 100,000 people. And when we started collecting data, it was 1.8 per 100,000. And that also was a reasonably low rate, comparatively speaking. So if we do a comparison of 2009-10 data, where we can actually do a cross-country comparison with some of our sort of usual Western democracy partners, what we find is that the Australian homicide rate sits reasonably well with those. It's actually quite low. Hopefully that can be seen on the screen okay. When we start breaking down the types of homicide, we break them down into four main types for the purpose of this particular slide. A domestic homicide, any death involving basically a family member or other person with a domestic relationship. We also have a fairly high proportion of domestic homicides and acquaintance homicides, or homicide between friends. And then we have a lesser number of homicides completed by strangers, and a whole range where the relationship remains unknown over the course of the event or subsequent investigation. In 2007-8, domestic homicides comprised 52% of all homicides, but only 36% of all homicides in 2008-9 and 9-10. They are one of the most common homicide events, as is fairly clear from this slide. Another good news story, we've had an 11% decline in acquaintance homicides between 1989 and 2009-10. So the homicides between friends have been going down. When we get into the the areas in more detail, I think we're going to find that in domestic homicides, intimate partner homicides have remained relatively stable over the course of the 22 years. We haven't had much success in reducing the rates. Other areas of homicide are falling. That's one area where we're still seeing a fairly significant number occurring. I put this one on because of its topicality, and in fact there's actually some recent government announcements in Queensland, I think just yesterday actually, around dealing with one-punch or coward punch homicides. So we found data for 3 years, 2007, 8, 9, 9, 10, and we identified 15 one-punch or coward punch homicides recorded in the data. So about 2% of homicides for those years. And we found that half were committed by a stranger and half were committed by friends or acquaintances of the victim. And in all cases they involved male offenders and male victims. So I'm just putting that one there because I'm sure we're going to come back to it over the course of tomorrow in particular. Just looking at domestic homicide events, of the 185 domestic homicides in the 2008 to 2010 period, which is our last published report, 2/3 were classified as intimate partner homicides, where the victim and offender shared a current or former intimate relationship. We've also managed to just recently produce a paper looking at same-sex intimate partner homicide, and in essence, about 2% of all intimate partner homicide appeared to be same-sex homicides. That's most likely an underreport because it's actually quite difficult sometimes to determine the nature of relationships for same-sex partnerships. And what we found is that for same-sex intimate partner incidents and opposite-sex intimate partner incidents, there are many common similarities. Males were represented as offenders. Stabbing using cutting weapons were the most common cause of death, and domestic arguments were the most common listed motive for the offence. As this slide also shows, we've got 12% of cases involving filicides where a custodial or non-custodial parent or a caregiver killed a child. We have 11% parricides where a child has killed a custodial, non-custodial parent or step-parent, and a very small number of cases where siblings kill each other. So again, what we're seeing very much is a very strong focus on intimate partner homicides, and that's also reflected in this program, I think, very well. Look at the temporal pattern of incidents of homicide. Where are they occurring, at what time of the day, what days? There are different temporal characteristics of homicide events. Homicides between strangers are disproportionately skewed towards the weekends, and over half, about 65% actually, occur specifically on Friday or Saturday evenings between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. Not sure we'd be that surprised by that, but that's where it occurs. Comparatively few stranger homicides occur on weekdays and rarely during the daylight hours. Acquaintance and domestic homicides were also most likely to occur during the evening hours, but the distribution was more spread across the days of the week. But there's still some increases towards the weekends. Again, we might expect that. In terms of weapon use in homicide incidents, one of the clear findings very much since 1989 to 1990 is that homicides resulting from the use of firearms have decreased. They've actually halved. 25% of homicides in 89-90 were known to have involved a firearm. In 2009-10, firearms were used in only 12% of homicide incidents. And most of the homicides that are currently being used in the last few years, all of them are unregistered and unlicensed. There's been quite a strong use of pistols as the weapon of choice, but that seems to be decreasing over the last few years, I think, because of police interdictions in that area. We also haven't experienced any sort of multiple killings, massacre type situations, a Port Arthur scenario since Port Arthur, and that's certainly attributed to Prime Minister Howard's gun buyback and the regulation of firearms. Maybe we've also been a bit lucky too. Conversely, the proportion of homicides involving knives has increased from 30% to 41% in the last 10 years of monitoring, 20 years of monitoring actually. So, yeah, what we're seeing is a shift in the weaponry, and firearms are much less likely to be involved than what they used to be. Another big one, quite a topical one, alcohol involvement in homicide incidents. In essence, about half of all homicides involve alcohol consumption. When you break that down more specifically, you see that particularly around acquaintance homicides, there's quite a strong relationship with victims and offenders drinking. It's less prominent but still significant for the domestic homicide incidents, and less apparent. It's only about 1/5 actually of all incidents involving stranger homicides. We look at the victimisation rates by gender and across time. Of the 541 victims killed throughout 2008-9 and 2009-10, 2/3 were male and 1/3 were female, so males had doubled the victimisation rate. The current female victimisation rate is 50% lower than at its peak in 1990-91, and the rate of male homicide victimisation has also decreased by approximately 35% since 1989-1990. So these are good news stories. They're not perfect stories, but they are good news stories. Overall, 66% of all female homicide victims killed throughout 2008, 9, 9, 10 were killed by an offender with whom they'd shared a domestic relationship, whether that be partner, child or parent. And females were overrepresented as victims in intimate partner homicide. In fact, 73% of intimate partner homicides. Almost half of all male homicide victims were killed by a friend or an acquaintance. 1/5 were killed by someone they shared a domestic relationship with. Indigenous Australians remain overrepresented as victims of homicide. Of the 541 homicide victims killed through 08, 09 and 9-10, 11% were identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. In 2009-10, the rate of homicide victimisation for Indigenous people was 4.1 per 100,000 of the Indigenous population, approximately 4 times the equivalent victimisation rate for non-Indigenous Australians. Now we're seeing historic lows in victimisation rate, but as you can see, they're still much higher than for the non-Indigenous population. When we look at offending, three interesting patterns also, we see that it's always been the case that at least 80% of homicide incidents are perpetrated by males. In some years, males have perpetrated up to 92% of homicides. In 8, 9, 9, 10, 88% of offenders were male. The rate of offending for males has declined. In 9, 10, the rate of male offending was 2.5 per 100,000. You can see it's dropped down from 3.5 since 89-90. And similarly, you see a small decrease in the rate for female offending as well. But given the levels are so much lower in it, it's much more difficult, I think, to see a drop there, a decline there. But overall, it's a good news story. Offending is going down. Victimisation is going down. Indigenous homicide offending. Indigenous Australians, again, overrepresented amongst homicide offenders, and particularly that was also the case in 2008, 9 and 9, 10. Indigenous Australians comprised 13% of the overall proportion of offenders. The overall rate of offending was 5 times higher when compared with the equivalent homicide rate for non-Indigenous population. The rate of offending among Indigenous males was close to 6 times higher than among non-Indigenous males. The rate of offending among the Indigenous female population was more than 3 times higher than a non-Indigenous female population. Overall, we're seeing the offending rate again dropping quite significantly, halving or more in the case of Indigenous female offenders, but we've still got a ways to go. Their representation is still quite a significant figure, and I think it stands out very starkly on the slide that I've been showing you this morning. Okay. So just to conclude, the rate of victimisation has been on a downward trend, particularly since 2001-2. Males and Indigenous persons of both genders continue to be overrepresented as both the victims and perpetrator of offences, despite record lows in offending. So we've got some good news stories happening. The proportion of domestic homicides has reached an historic low in recent years, but intimate partner homicides have generally been maintained at fairly stable rates. We aren't having success there. We've had an 11% drop in acquaintance homicides, again, some good news there. And we're seeing alcohol consumption by either the victim or the offender in at least half of all homicide incidents. And illicit drug use has actually been found in 1 in 5 incidents. We're seeing the use of firearms going down. We're seeing the use of knives going up, especially in domestic and acquaintance homicides. We also know that 1 in 10 of homicides that are committed during the course of another crime, whether it be drug-related, another form of violence, or robberies. We also know that almost half of the perpetrators had a criminal history. About 47% of males and about 34% of females who commit a homicide have actually already got a criminal history. Now, over the course of the next 2 days, some of these trends will become explored or be investigated further, and hopefully in a lot more detail. This has just been a setting the scene, and I hope you've found it a useful way to sort of set the context for what we're going to hear over the coming 2 days. Thank you very much.